Hello, this is Evan here from the Latinum Institute, and in this video I want to talk to you today about a new series that I've been putting together. And if you go to latinum.org.uk and check the website there, you'll find that there is a section called Shadowing, and I'm going to be talking about this. This new section has been developed within the last month, and it was developed in response to a query I had from a student of mine who had discovered a method, and he had spoken about it with a few other people and was using it himself and was finding that it was helping his Latin tremendously. And his method was as follows. He found a text that had a literal translation, and he made a recording of that literal translation and then listened to it while reading the Latin. Now, his problem was he had a great deal of difficulty finding suitable resources for doing this. Over the years, I've come across an enormous number of texts that are suitable for this and were composed for this method. It's not a new method at all. The earliest texts that were composed using this method date back at least 300 years. Now, with Latin, as you may know, a literal translation, if it was going to map onto the Latin as the Latin was written, would be unintelligible. You could have a literal translation mapping the Latin, but you would read it and not really understand what you were reading. So what happened was this. About 300-400 years ago, it was realized that if the Latin syntax, the structure of the Latin, was shifted around slightly, still keeping it grammatical, but changing the order of the received text, so it no longer is exactly as it was received. And then you also jig around with the vernacular translation so that the two sort of match. So you've adjusted the Latin slightly and you adjust the English in this case slightly. So the English doesn't read well as a piece of English prose, and the Latin doesn't read as well as if it were composed originally, but it's grammatical. And you reach this sort of halfway house where the English has been jiggled with and the Latin's been jiggled with, and then you can have a translation where the English maps onto the Latin. So you can listen to the English and read the Latin, and every phrase will match the Latin that you are encountering, and it will kind of make some sense to the degree possible. The Latin, when it's changed around like this, is usually referred to as the ordo verborum, the order of the words, matching the order of the English or the French. If you were having a French interlinear or French parallel translation, your Latin would be slightly different because it would be mapped onto French syntax. But most of the editions that have been published for English. The method died out in the early 1800s. Teachers stopped using it, whereas it had been used for hundreds of years. And it was used because it's an extremely effective method of getting a student to cover an enormous amount of ground very, very quickly. After the 1850s, Latin became a hobby, effectively. There was no practical reason for learning it, so the whole way of studying Latin shifted away from practical Latin to grammar, testable study, sort of treating it like a sort of scientific subject, like kind of mathematics. And the fact that it was a language sort of fell by the way because there was no longer any practical reason for knowing this language. No one was writing scientific journals in it, no one was writing chemistry textbooks in it anymore, no one was writing anything in it anymore. Bits of biological descriptions of plants, that's about it. And that still continues on to this day, but Latin is no longer compulsory for the description of plants, but its tradition dies hard. So, but that's a very formulaic kind of Latin, and it's pretty much the last practical surviving use of the language. So from the time when this method was developed, the earliest text I know about is on the late or mid 1400s, so it's quite a long time ago. One text that I have recorded is the Sententiae Pueriles, which was first published in 1490 by Leonard Cullmann, and this book went through various editions. The last edition I'm aware of is in the early 1800s. The edition I'm using is by John Sterling, DD, and his edition is fantastic. What he does is he's got a 3-part page, the Latin in its original at the top of the page, and the bottom 2 columns, one English and one Latin. But the Latin is the Ordo Verborum, where the Latin has been moved around to match the English sentence structure. So if you're reading the English, your eyes can flip across the Latin and you will have word for word. Even better, if you're listening to the English, then your eyes are on the Latin and you hear the English translation as you read. So this is a very effective way of reading a book if you are a beginner, or even if you are a more advanced student. This means you can cover a lot of ground. If you don't know what a word means, there it is, and it's a good way of learning the language. Then once you've learned it with this method, with the Ordo Verborum, then you go and you read the text in its original. And that's, every page is structured in this way. In Sterling's Sententiae Pueriles, that was published in the 1700s. And the most recent edition of the Sententiae Pueriles that I know about is in the 1800s, 1830s. So that's English to Latin. I've done 2 English to Latin shadowing recordings so far. 2 complete books have been done. One is the Sententiae Pueriles, and the other is something called The Scholar's Guide by Clarke. Now, Clarke was a prolific writer of Latin textbooks, and he wrote quite a number of books using literal translations. So he took the colloquies of Corderius and he rearranged them slightly to make them fit with a literal translation, which in his case is parallel. And what Clarke does, it's very, very clever, is he'll put a phrase in italics in the Latin and it'll be matched in italics in the English on the other side. The next phrase will not be in italics and the Latin won't be in italics, and it goes backwards and forwards. So your eye can flip across from one to the other very, very quickly if you're reading it. But of course, if you have the audio, that doesn't matter anymore. Your eye just is on the Latin and you're listening to the translation. The Sententiae Pueriles I'm also doing in the reverse, in the normal shadowing method, where I'm reading the Latin very slowly, and then while you listen to me read the Latin, your eyes are on the English. Another text that I'm doing in that form, where I'm reading the Latin very, very slowly, is the works of Celsus on medicine. Now, this text was published by William Underwood. William Underwood was the son-in-law of Mr. Hamilton, who published a large number of these interlinear texts where the syntax has been moved around in the way that I just described. And there's a method called the Hamiltonian method, which if you look on Google Books, you'll find a large number of these published texts. So Celsus on medicine is a useful text, but because there's lots of vocabulary that is possibly a bit obscure because it's a medical text, this is a very good way of getting through it very rapidly, learning that vocabulary without having to look in a dictionary, and then you can read the text in its original without the readjustment made in the Ordo Verborum of Underwood's text. It's a long text. My recordings are about 20 minutes long, which is sort of enough time to focus. Another advantage of this method is that you can't always have a good day. Sometimes you have a day where you really can't concentrate and you want to study. So this method allows you to study on days when you're feeling a bit off, or you just, you've done some hard work and you want to do something that's more relaxing. So you pick up one of these texts and you listen to my shadowing either in reverse from from English to Latin, where you're reading the Latin, or the other way around, where I'm reading the Latin and your eyes are on the English. So Celsus on Medicine is being produced. That text was written, composed, to help medical students pass the exams for the Worshipful Company of Apothecaries. You had to pass their exams in Latin, knowing Celsus, to become a pharmacist, because you had to write your prescriptions in Latin. So pharmacists had to know Latin in the 1830s, and Underwood wrote a grammar book to help them, and he wrote this. Both of these, or the grammar book, I've published as an audiobook some years ago. That's available in the catalogue at Latinum. And there's also another text called the Materia Medica, also for pharmacists, and that has recipes for making sulfuric acid and potash and stuff like that, all in Latin with an interlinear English translation. So it's a wonderful resource and gives you a fantastic range of vocabulary that you wouldn't normally get. So that's also available at Latinum. So that's it at the moment. I'm busy recording Hamilton's Ovid Metamorphoses Book 1, which is also being done. I'm doing that in Latin, so you listen to me in Latin and you look at the English while that happens. That's going to be, I think, the first in that series will appear on the 30th of this month, the 30th of June, and then once a week, one episode will appear of that. It's going to be released in series, and that's shadowing. And on my page on shadowing, you'll find that I've linked some of the academic material related to it. Before I put any time into this, I wanted to have a look and see whether there was any substance to this method. And so I went on Google Scholar and looked up shadowing language study, and it appears that this method has undergone something of a resurgence, but mainly in China and Japan. And the research all appears to be coming out of Japan and China, where there's a focus on this method as a way of getting students to get to grips with English pronunciation and to learn quickly. And I imagine also the way that classes are taught. Sometimes you have very, very large classes in these countries, especially in China. This method enables a teacher to teach an enormous number of people at the same time, where the teacher can be reading a text and the students can be shadowing all at the same time. I've seen videos, Chinese classrooms, where this method is being used. So have a look at my page on shadowing. I've made a short video there where I summarize the research in the video, so you can see how this method can be used and how these texts can be used. So that's shadowing from the Latinum Institute, and it's a new resource. Vale.